A young soldier, a capture, and an escape across enemy lines. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 7 of Nonfiction Fridays, the series where I share unbelievable stories that really happened. In this episode, we'll be talking about Winston Churchill before he was so famous, and an incident that helped cement his name forever in our history books. It's November in 1899, and Winston Churchill is working as a war correspondent. At this point in time, he's found himself in a situation where he's with the general, and they are essentially trying to keep the forces surrounding them at bay, and part of doing that is sending out the cavalry 10 or 15 miles every single day just to keep an eye on the surrounding areas. In order to help the cavalry with this task, the general decided it would be a good idea to send out extra troops on an armored train. Now, an armored train might sound really powerful and intimidating, but as Winston recalled in his memoirs, it was actually really easy to derail one, as all you had to do was blow up part of the line further on and it would leave it pretty much stranded. A man named Captain Haldane was put in charge of this expedition, and he was friendly with Winston Churchill. So he asked Winston if he wanted to go with him, even though the captain thought that maybe the general hadn't really thought this through. He wasn't that worried about it, and he was a young man who was frankly excited about war, as was the culture of the time, and wanted as much adventure as he could get. And since Winston felt exactly the same way, he quickly said yes. The day comes and they make it 14 miles outside of their base camp with no problems. They don't see anything, so they telegraph that information back to base that all is well. But like many times in war, an instant can go from perfectly fine to incredibly dangerous, and that's exactly what happened on this day. Winston is on the final train compartment, and he has his head and shoulders looking out over the landscape. He notices on a hillside that there are a few figures, and that kind of alerts something in his brain, but before he has time to even form a thought or an idea, he notices these 3 flashes of light, just kind of indescribable, moving toward him. And once they pass, he realizes it was shrapnel, the first shrapnel he had ever seen, and nearly his last. Just as he has the thought that he should send someone from the back car that he is on all the way to the front of the train to tell the engine to slow down in case something is happening, just as he thinks that, there is an incredible shock to the train car that he is in, and he tumbles to the floor head over heels. The men around him do the same, and it's very clear that they are now under attack. Within a few seconds, Winston is back on his feet, but some of the men around him are not so lucky. He climbs back up so that he can peer out of the train again and kind of get his bearings and see what the situation is. As he does so, he notices scores of enemy men. They're climbing the hills, and they are laying down on the crest of these hills in the grass, and they are opening fire. So Winston, having already at such a young age a good head on his shoulders, talked to the captain, his friend who had gotten him to come on this mission with him, and said, "You stay here and essentially fire back so that the enemy feels they can't come too close. So that'll keep them busy while I go out along the backside of the train to be protected from the fire and just get a feel for what's going on," because they're on the last car, so they don't really know what's gone on from the rest of the train. So as Winston goes along, he realizes that while the engine car is still on the tracks, the one right after that, the first truck of the train, has been completely flipped over, crushing some people underneath it, and people that were in that car are severely injured. And there's the 2 trucks after that are like kind of crammed together, and there's just injured people everywhere, and people are kind of in this disarray and chaos, not knowing what to do or what's really happening, trying to get their grip on the situation so that they can figure out what to do to fight back. At this point, some of the men are making their way to the opposite side of the train, using the train itself as a barrier against the fire, the open fire that's now going back and forth between the 2 groups. At this moment, the train driver comes leaping out of the engine car. He has a severe gash on his face, and it's just blood is streaming down, and this man is in a complete and utter panic. He just can't even really form coherent thoughts or sentences. He's just having a complete freak out, essentially. And so Winston knows that this man is the only one who really knows how to operate this train, and without him being in his full thoughts and coherency. Without him, there's really little chance of escape. So Winston thinks to himself, how can I get this guy to sort of snap back into it? So he says something to this guy about how, you never get hit twice in one day, so you're good there. And, this is a chance for you to really get some recognition, and, you'll definitely be essentially a hero after this, which wasn't necessarily true, but it was just something that Winston had to say in order to get, a handle on this situation. And it worked. The driver kind of came back to himself, and they realized that there was work that needed to be done if they were going to make it out of this thing. Winston had the idea. He wanted to use the engine car to push the two rammed cars blocking the tracks out of the way, so that then the rest of the cars on the backside, which hadn't been as heavily impacted, could be connected again to the engine car, and then they could just go on their way and make it back to base camp and essentially have the force of their entire army behind them. Unfortunately, though, it wouldn't be as easy as it sounds. So it's not that they can just use this engine car as like a ramming rod. I mean, they can a little bit, but there's the fear that the pressure will push it off the tracks completely, or they could just twerk it the wrong way. And, without this, they are really stranded. So they set about doing this really carefully, and Winston is trying to coordinate with, several different people. He's going back and forth. It's kind of a miracle that within all of this, he didn't get shot. And at first, they can't even get the engine car to get enough traction to sort of push against the other trains that are blocking the rails at all. And it's really not looking good. Finally, they're able to move one of the two jammed cars together just enough so that they think that they might be able to manually push over one of these derailed cars off of the tracks and out of the way. Because clearly it's not working with the engine alone. 20 men are chosen to do this, and it means that they would have to get in the way of enemy fire. So it's incredibly dangerous and really risky. And out of the 20, only 10 men, feel that they have enough courage to do this. And wonderfully enough, they do manage to do that just by strength alone. So they think they've gotten this sorted out. They've got this car laying just off the rails. And so they start moving the engine car again to try to knock the second car off. And just as they're getting close to the second car, they realize that because the engine, the footplate of the engine car itself is 6 inches wider than the other cars and the track, so the very edge of that footplate is hitting on the car that they just flipped off the rails. So basically, they're back where they started. To put a really long story short, they were, at the end of the day, not able to accomplish this. So they had to look at what they had and come up with a new idea. So their idea was to just take the engine car, which was now crammed with severely wounded men, take that car, and they would try to run it at a foot's pace so that people, the cavalry on the other side who were wounded, or just the rest of the group, could walk on this side of the train if the enemy is on this side, so that they have the train engine car as like a shield, and the really wounded men can, who can't walk for themselves that distance, are able to be sort of carried back. So they try this and it doesn't work. Obviously the engine car can keep going, but it goes too fast for the men to keep up, so the men get left behind, and it's basically just a mess of a situation. Amidst all this struggle, and this has been going on for hours now, Winston looks up with some of the men he's alongside on the side of the tracks, and he sees in the distance 2 figures. And he doesn't realize at first that they are in fact enemy men, but they are. And while he tries to make his escape, climbing under a fence and just trying to do whatever he can to get out of this, he is not able to. He is, in fact, captured and brought with the rest of the men, even though, as a war correspondent, the rules for whether or not he can be a prisoner are a little bit tricky. They are taken to the enemy's base camp, and Winston, because he is working for the press, is pulled out of the main group of soldiers, and Winston knows that in many situations they would not hesitate to just kill him on the spot, because he's under no protection really as a war correspondent, especially because he opened fire on the other enemy when war correspondents were apparently not supposed to carry weapons, but he had carried them, and because he had helped the cavalry try to escape, they felt that they had every right to contain him, and so they did. It may have also helped that Winston had such a well-known family name. He was standing in the rain, waiting off to the side while they decided essentially whether or not to let him live, and he thought for sure that this was it. So they walk up to him, they call him Old Chappie, and sort of laugh and say, "We don't catch the son of a lord every day." And that was that. Winston is quite annoyed by this because now not only is he a prisoner, but he feels that he is missing out on the adventure of war, something his young mind really had in it that, he was missing out on so many great stories he could tell later and just great times, even though, it's not really how we think of war today, but that is definitely how Winston saw it as a young man in 1899. He was brought to a prisoner of war camp with the other men in his group, but he absolutely hated captivity so much that he, in just 3 weeks, had already planned his escape. At first, he tried to get out through his conversational and sort of debate tactics, through his mind, essentially. He said to his captors, I'm a member of the press, and it's really not appropriate for you to be keeping me. He tried to argue all that he could so that he could be let go on proper channels, essentially. But they just weren't having it at this camp, let alone at the base camp where they first decided he would be a prisoner. So he knows that that's not going to work for him, and he's got to find a sneakier way. Every cage has its weak point, and Winston was determined to find it. So he and a few friends noticed that around the perimeter, which was of course filled with floodlights and gates and guards, there was one section that was not as well covered. Still covered, just not as well. And they realized after watching it for a while that if you just happen to find the right moment where two of these guards were looking the other way, then you might be able to very quickly climb up and get over the barrier, drop down into the bushes of an estate next door. So that's exactly what they tried to do, and two of his friends went before him, but they couldn't do it. They just couldn't find that right moment in time to jump over. But when Winston went, he actually found this perfect golden moment, and he thought to himself, am I really doing this? Am I really going to jump outside of this gate with absolutely no idea really where I am and no real plan as to how to get somewhere else where, I have people on my side of this war? But, the moment was there and he took it. So he jumps over, and on the way down, his coat gets caught in the fence, and he's just it's just such an awkward moment because he knows that at any second they could turn around and see him, and he has to take extra time to get himself untangled. Luckily, he did so. He landed down in the bushes, and then he waited because he thought that his friends, who he had planned this with, were going to come along as well. Some time goes by, at least an hour or two, and he's right next to the gate, so he can hear and see everything still. He hasn't really moved. So two people he knows comes up, two people that were sort of in on their escape plan, and they are pretending to talk to each other until one man starts sort of just talking for the sake of talking, just making something up, and the other man says in Winston's direction, the jig's up, it's over, they think something might be happening, and the other two just can't make it out. And then they asked him if he could get back in, knowing that it would be better for him if he just got back in the gate and they could maybe try again another time. But Winston says, quite frankly, he can't get back in. So he has really no other choice at this point but to accept his decision and to go forward and just see what happens. And he fully expects to get caught within 24 hours, but he'd rather, it's just kind of the mentality he had at this age, he would rather just fight for it and see if he could get away with it rather than just completely give in. And that's what he did. He really wants to run, but he knows that he can't. So he just, as commonplace as possible, walks down the middle of the road. He actually passes the guard that is outside the facility, and the guards all know him, but he just, he's wearing a civilian suit, and he just keeps his head turned the other way, and he just walks as nonchalantly as possible until he hits the suburbs. And at that point, he sits down and he sort of takes stock of what he has. He has the civilian suit he's wearing. He has 75 pounds of money and 4 slabs of chocolate. He has no map, no meat, no food. All of this were going to be supplied by the other men he was escaping with. So he's really kind of down on his luck and in a really uncomfortable situation already, and he knows that the outlook is not very good. He also doesn't speak the local language, and he knows that come morning when they do muster, he's not going to be there, and his escape will definitively be known. And that's really all the time he has to take some sort of action and get as far away as he can. All he knows is that he has to be at least 200 or 300 miles away from the border or to where he could reach some sort of safety. He doesn't know which way to go even. He's not even that sure of where he is, and no one else knows where he is. So he's really in a predicament here. And as he's just pondering this, he looks up into the sky and he's just thinking about his situation, and he spots Orion. On a previous misadventure of Winston's, he had used Orion to find water in the desert and to just have a guide point to get him out of another tricky spot. So he remembers that experience. He sees Orion in the night sky and he says, you helped me once. Let's see if you can help me again. And he decides to use that as his guide. So he started walking using these stars and a set of train tracks as his guide. He decided to hop aboard a train to make the miles go faster. It was still in the middle of the night, and he knew that the chances of him getting caught were pretty low. A train comes, he manages to catch on, and he finds himself in a car full of coal sacks. And it's here that he actually falls asleep. He's so probably exhausted from just the adrenaline and the experience that he actually falls asleep. And when he wakes up, it's a few hours later, it's still dark, and he's kind of panicked that he could have let this happen. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know where this train will stop and when, if it'll be checked, and he just feels that it's time for him to get off this thing. So he does. He jumps off, he rolls into the ditches, and he's unharmed. He finds a little pool, and he drinks as much water as he can possibly get in him, because he knows that the next day, when it's daylight, he can't really go anywhere. He finds this little grove to hide in, and that's pretty much where he sits all day, really hungry, really tired, really confused and unsure of what to do with zero plan. It's just a really overwhelming situation. I mean, all of this he's just gone through, and he's just wearing a civilian suit. He's out in the elements, no food. It was uncomfortably cold in the early morning, and then as the day went on, it was stiflingly hot with zero relief and nothing to even fill his time with other than the anxiety and the thought of what's coming next for him. Even at this point in his life, Winston was a very well-read and well-educated man, and he was looking for, all these things he'd always read about that philosophers said or adventurers said about some sort of peace or calm coming over them. And he felt none of that at all. He felt no peace and no calm, and he kept waiting for it, for some sort of, primal instinct to take over, and it never came. He was just really anxious about the whole situation. He felt that God's grace was the only thing that could save him, and so he just started praying. Night comes again. He still doesn't have any idea what to do, but he thinks, I'll just hop on another train. And so he, makes his way back to the train, being really sneaky. He's around civilization now, so he's kind of on his knees and elbows, crawling through grass and just trying to hide his way to the train tracks. And when he gets there, he waits for hours and no train comes. He waits more hours and no train comes. And he realizes there's no train coming. The question becomes, now what? So he sees these kind of fires in the distance, and he thinks, I'll walk towards those. I'll take a risk. It could be someone that would help me. Who knows? And he starts walking towards them, and he gets about a mile before it clicks in how crazy a thought that is, and that's definitely not going to help him. So he actually walks back the other way a mile. And then when he gets there, he thinks, what am I doing? He was completely wrecked with indecision. He had no idea what to do. And then suddenly that feeling of calm just came over him. And he just decided to trust this instinctual pull. He was just going to follow whatever this otherness, call it the voice of God, call it spirit, who knows, whatever this feeling, that gut feeling you get that comes from something other than yourself, whatever that feeling was, he was just going to follow it. And that's what he did. So he starts walking towards the fires again, and they're way farther than he thought, but he just keeps going and going and going. And then he realizes that he is actually getting close to something that he thought were fires, but are actually the entrance to a mine. And he knows that some of these mines are still kept up by British people or British descendants, and that there's a chance he might be able to find someone British that he can connect with and that might be willing to help him. It's still super risky. I mean, he's in enemy country, and there's no telling who these houses belong to. So he literally just picks a house at random, following that feeling, that instinct, and he knocks on the door. He does this having no plan for what to say, no story that he's ready to spill out. He just knocks before he even really knows what he's doing. And when the door opens, a man is standing there, and he essentially just says, "What do you want?" Winston formed this perfect lie. It just came out of his mouth, like, without any effort at all. He has no idea where it came from, but he just made up this story on the spot about how he was a local worker and he thought that he had fallen out of a train and must have hit his head because he's been unconscious for hours. He just woke up here. He doesn't know what happened. And he thinks his shoulder is dislocated. Like, complete garbage. None of it's true. But he just spews all this information. And the man who opened the door said, well, I guess you'd better come in. So he opens the door, and it's really dark inside. It's still nighttime out. And he lets Winston walk first into this dark, dark room, and the guy comes in behind him. And when he finds himself inside this room, this man, the owner of the house, is at one end of the table, Winston is at the other, and this man pulls out a revolver, and he puts it on the table. And Winston says, I guess it's time I told you the truth. And the man says, yes, I think it is. So Winston tells him this whole story of the past few days, what has happened to him, and he has no idea if this man is friend or foe. And as he's finished telling this shortened, quick and dirty version of what has happened to him, the man just lunges at him. And in this moment, he has no idea if he's lunging in a friendly way or a attacking sort of way. And before he even knows what's happening, the man has grabbed his hand and he's shaking it. And he essentially says, you know, thank God you've come here. It's the only house within 20 miles where you would have found, you know, a fellow Briton. Of course I'll help you out. And he says, you must be hungry. And he kind of goes into relief mode and planning mode. And so he gets Winston a leg of mutton from the kitchen and he says, wait here. So Winston eats his fill and he's feeling pretty good. I mean, it's kind of a crazy thing to go from having no plan and living in constant anxiety and enemy territory, not knowing what's going to happen to you, to being in a situation where you've sort of found a friend and somebody who's going to help you. And the relief is immense. But of course, the journey is not over yet. An hour later, the man comes back and he says he's kind of formulated a bit of a plan, but it's not going to be easy because while there are some British people living near the mine, the vast majority are locals who work there. And there's even locals in the same house and people who work for him. And they're going to question where his food has gone and where all these limited resources are going. So it's going to be kind of hard to keep Winston fed and hidden, and they've got to make sure that every move they make is really well thought out. He even lets on that earlier that day, the authorities had been by asking everyone if they had seen Winston Churchill, you know, plastering his name everywhere. There were officers really apparently making a fuss about his escape, that it did not look good for them, and they absolutely wanted him returned as a prisoner of war. There was even a reward for his capture or information leading to it. So anyone that was in this camp, if they had known about it, then it's really likely they would have turned him in. So the man says, all right, come with me. And Winston follows him into the entrance of the mine. They meet up with 2 or 3 other British guys who are, you know, who've been filled in on what's going on, and they're all willing to help and get Winston out. So they lead him into the mine and essentially give him a sleeping mat, some cigars, and some whiskey, and a candlestick, and they essentially say, don't move, and we'll come get you when we can. So Winston falls asleep. He is absolutely exhausted, and he must sleep for a really long time. When he wakes up, it's of course dark. He's in a mine, and he's looking around for his candlestick. He can't find it. So he's forced to just sit and wait in the dark for hours until someone comes back to find him. When his host finally comes back, he explains that he had to go 20 miles just to get Winston a chicken, and that for the rest of the time he's here, he'll have to ask for extra helpings and then kind of sneakily put some food into, you know, a little package he'll keep like at his meals, and then he'll bring it to Winston later. So he's already trying to formulate a plan. He's talking to the few other people, and they're all trying to find a way to get him out. So they're essentially just saying, hang tight. And when he asked Winston why he was sitting in the dark all this time, Winston says, I can't find my candlestick. And the guy says, oh, the rats must have taken it. And apparently rats had been introduced to this mine ages ago and done very, very well. And now they were everywhere, and they were fond of stealing things. And he said, anything you want to keep, make sure you put it under your pillow. During the nights Winston slept and stayed in this mine, he was awoken several times with a little tug feeling underneath his head, and it was rats always trying to get at his stuff, which he had to sleep on top of just to keep it intact. So the day finally comes when they've arrived at a plan to get him out, to sort of smuggle him to the border as close as they can get. And the plan involves a local-ish British farmer who exports wool. So the wool is put in these big bales on train beds, okay? And so they are going to put the bales in a specific way so that there's a hole in the middle that Winston can kind of camp out in. And that's exactly what happens. They've got him set up in there. It's kind of like a fort, like a secret hidden fort. And he's going to be in there for, they don't really know how long. If it was in perfect conditions, it would take about 16 hours. But with the war going on, there's constant delays. So he's set up in there with 2 chickens, some slices of meat, 2 jugs of cold tea, and just sort of sent on his way. And I mean, they all say essentially good luck, you know? And so off he goes. 3 days go by with him in this tiny compartment without really being able to see much or stand up or really know even where he is on the journey before he reaches a place where he knows it's the border. He knows that he has gotten to another country now and that he can get out. It doesn't mean it's super safe for him because, again, everyone's looking for him, but he is, you know, he's one step closer. So he makes his way out of the train. He sort of does it as nonchalantly as possible so as not to draw attention. He's filthy, and so are the workers that are unloading things, so he kind of fits in pretty easily, which is good. And as he's walking past the train area, he comes to a gate and he notices the man who owns the wool. And they don't say anything to each other because obviously this man can't be implicated in any way. But the man kind of nods at Winston and Winston sees him. And so the man starts walking and Winston knows that he is kind of being signaled to just follow. So he follows this man and blocks go by. They're walking for quite a while. And then the man suddenly stops. He kind of takes a step back, leans against a building, and nods his head in the opposite direction. Winston turns his head, and there it is. It's the British consulate, and he thinks, I've done it. I've made it. This is it. So he very excitedly walks right up to that building, and he knocks on the door, and he says, I would like to see the British consul, please. And he's super excited. He thinks he's like done, good to go with this journey. And the secretary says, excuse me, sir, I don't know who you think you are, but the consul is busy right now, so you're going to have to come back tomorrow at 9. And Winston is like, in his brain, you're kidding, right? Like, I just came all this way, and people are looking for me, and my name has made the headlines, and yet you're sitting here telling me to come back tomorrow at 9. So he is not having it. He just says to the secretary, like, I demand to see the consul. He kind of makes a fuss. The consul hears it from upstairs where he's like having lunch or something, who knows. And he comes down, asks this, you know, disheveled man who the heck he is. And he says, I'm Winston Churchill. And the guy says, well then, come in. And that's pretty much it. From there on out, he's given some good food, a hot bath, new clothes, and he's really set up in a lot of ways for his future. And because of this event, his name would become so well known, and it was really a big part of what made him a hero and memorable in the minds of Britons as, you know, this war correspondent who has escaped. It was a big part of his identity in his early career. It might make you happy to know that years later, you might remember the engine driver of the train that was first attacked and how Winston had told him that he'd probably be rewarded for this. Well, that didn't happen, but years later, when Winston was in power, he made sure that this man was recognized. He was given an award. So Winston did, in fact, keep his word on that. It just took a couple of decades to get there. If you liked this story and you want to learn more about Winston Churchill, definitely check out his autobiography, My Early Life. It's truly fantastic and really gives you an idea of the mind of one of history's most memorable characters. You'll also find a great deal of inspiration in his mindset. It's a great book and one I hope to read again. Reading it in part for this series was really enjoyable and made me miss it. So I do hope that if you like war history or just world history, then you will definitely check this out and learn more about Winston Churchill. And finally, if you liked this video, give it a quick thumbs up and be sure to tune in next Friday for episode 8. The first season of Nonfiction Friday is experimental, and there is only 1 episode left. If you did like this series, like this video, be sure to drop a comment letting me know so that I can decide if I want to plan a season 2. And if you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead, press that subscribe button, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys.